truth that shakes the foundations of what we've been taught. A truth that leads us back, not to Europe, not to the halls of Rome, but to Africa, to Ethiopia.
What if the Bible you grew up with is missing something critical? Not a footnote, not a lost fragment, but a teaching deliberately kept out of reach. In Ethiopia, monks have just released a translated resurrection passage that was guarded for centuries. It describes what happened after the resurrection and why those words were never meant to spread freely.
They saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
The implications are immediate, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. The monks who never left the story. In the highlands of Ethiopia, there existed monks who were trained for one purpose long before they were considered adults. These were not wandering holy men or storytellers repeating legends. They were scribes, guardians, and witnesses. From an early age, selected boys entered monastic schools where they learned to read and write the ancient church language, to copy texts by hand, and to memorize long passages without error. According to Ethiopian Orthodox monastic tradition, certain monks were assigned to guard theological texts deemed too sensitive for general circulation. As centuries passed, Ethiopia faced repeated invasions, internal conflict, and pressure from outside religious authorities. When churches were threatened and libraries became targets, monks did not attempt to negotiate or hide the texts in cities. They left with them. According to local traditions, groups of monks moved manuscripts into places where armies could not easily follow. They chose cliffs, caves, deserts, and remote mountain monasteries. These locations were not chosen for beauty or symbolism. They were chosen because escape would be nearly impossible and access could be controlled. For many monks, entering these places meant cutting all ties with ordinary life. They accepted that they would never return to towns or villages. They would not marry. They would not raise families. If they fell ill or were injured, help might never come. According to reports passed down in monastic communities, this was not seen as a tragedy. It was seen as a necessary exchange. Distance from the world was the price of keeping the text untouched. Inside these monasteries, not every manuscript was treated equally. Ordinary scripture could be copied and read. Certain writings could not. Some texts were sealed inside inner chambers that most monks were forbidden to enter. Access was sometimes limited to a single appointed guardian. That guardian lived beside the chamber and never left his post. When he died, another monk was chosen to replace him. The duty continued. The individual did not. To reduce the risk even further, the most sensitive material was not preserved in a single place. According to monastic accounts, parts of certain texts were separated and stored in different monasteries. One location held one section, another held the next. Even if one manuscript was stolen or destroyed, it would be incomplete. The teaching could not be reconstructed easily or misused by outsiders. There were moments when monks made decisions that appear extreme even today. If a manuscript was believed to have been altered, mistranslated, or accessed without permission, it was sometimes destroyed. Pages were burned or buried. In some cases, parts of the resurrection teaching were never written down at all. According to reports, senior monks memorized them word for word and passed them only to those judged ready. Some believe entire sections were allowed to disappear when leaders believed the world was not prepared to receive them. These monks took vows knowing the consequences. They prepared themselves to be imprisoned, tortured, or killed, rather than reveal locations or contents. Their belief was clear. Scripture was permanent. The body was not. Their fear was not death. Their fear was misuse. While these monks were hiding and preserving texts, other Christian centers were doing the opposite. They were deciding which books would stay and which would be removed. Those choices would define the Bible most of the world knows today. A Bible that was never cut down. The Ethiopian Bible does not begin as a variation. It begins as a problem. It contains 81 books, and there is no historical moment where those books were added later or restored after loss. The record shows something more disturbing. While other regions reduced their scriptures over time, Ethiopia did not. The collection stayed whole. Nothing was removed. Nothing was corrected downward. That alone forces a hard question. If other Christian traditions ended with fewer books, then something did not simply disappear everywhere. In the earliest period of Christianity, this difference made sense. There was no single Bible at the beginning. No fixed list existed. Communities relied on texts they received, copied, and trusted. Letters moved between churches. Accounts of Jesus circulated alongside laws, teachings, and instructions. What mattered was whether a community actually read and relied on a text, not whether it had been officially approved by a distant authority. Different regions used different collections in practice, and no single institution yet existed with the power to declare one final version of Scripture for everyone. In most parts of the Roman world, that changed over time. Church leaders began to argue that unity required agreement, agreement required selection, and selection required exclusion. Councils met. Lists were proposed. Some books were approved. Others were set aside. This process did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, through decisions made by people with political pressure and growing institutional power. Ethiopia followed a different path. Christianity arrived there early, but without the same outside control. There was no emperor forcing agreement. There was no distant authority demanding uniformity. According to church tradition, Ethiopian communities continued reading the texts they had already received. They did not see a reason to discard books simply because another region had done so. No external force arrived to tell them to stop. As a result, the Ethiopian canon remained large. These books were not treated as curiosities or secret writings. They were read publicly, taught in churches, and copied by hand across generations. This is important. These were not texts rediscovered in a cave centuries later. They were part of daily religious life. They shaped teaching, belief, and practice over long periods of time. In the West, many of these same texts slowly vanished from use. This did not always happen because they were proven false or fraudulent. In many cases, they were excluded because they raised problems. Some complicated theology. Some challenged simple ideas of authority. Some introduced concepts that were difficult to control or explain. Over time, exclusion hardened into absence. What makes this more unsettling is that exclusion and preservation were happening at the same time. While Western churches were narrowing their canon, Ethiopian churches were continuing to copy the same books. This means the loss was not universal. Christianity did not forget these texts everywhere, it forgot them in specific places. According to some scholars, this difference explains why Ethiopian Christianity often feels unfamiliar to Western readers. It developed with a wider textual foundation. Ideas that disappeared elsewhere continued to shape belief in Ethiopia. This does not mean one tradition is automatically right and the other wrong. It means the histories diverged. By the time the Protestant and Catholic canons became fixed, the Ethiopian canon was already settled in its own way. There was no moment when Ethiopia chose 81 books in opposition to anyone else. It simply never chose to remove them. At this point, skepticism is natural. A larger canon sounds impressive, but claims mean little without evidence. That changed when modern science was finally allowed to examine the manuscripts themselves. When science removed the excuse. For decades, critics relied on a single argument to dismiss Ethiopian manuscripts. They argued that the texts were too late to matter. They claimed the manuscripts were medieval copies, written long after Christianity had already been defined elsewhere. As long as that claim stood, the content did not need to be taken seriously. That shield collapsed when Ethiopian monasteries finally permitted scientific testing. After long hesitation driven by preservation concerns, church authority, and the fear of damaging texts that could never be replaced. Radiocarbon dating works on one principle. It measures the age of organic material itself. It does not consider tradition, reputation, or belief. To do this, scientists must remove microscopic samples from parchment or ink, which is why testing sacred manuscripts remained controversial for years. When the tests were finally carried out, the results were impossible to ignore. The materials did not match the Middle Ages. They pointed to a much earlier period. The moment that changed everything came with the testing of the Garima Gospels, illustrated gospel manuscripts preserved in an Ethiopian monastery and long assumed to be medieval because of their artwork. Laboratory analysis dated the parchment and inks to between the 4th and 7th centuries. That placed these manuscripts centuries earlier than most surviving Latin and Greek gospel manuscripts commonly used as benchmarks in Western scholarship. This mattered because of timing. These manuscripts were not produced after Christian doctrine had settled. They were created while Christian belief was still forming, while debates over Scripture were active, and while many texts later removed in the West were still being read elsewhere. The idea that Ethiopia preserved a late or watered-down version of Christianity no longer fit the evidence. The academic response was quiet but revealing. There were no public apologies or dramatic reversals. Instead, scholarly language began to change. Phrases like likely medieval and probably late slowly disappeared from serious discussion. Researchers acknowledged, often reluctantly, that Ethiopia preserved some of the earliest surviving Christian material known today. This conclusion was not based on tradition or belief. It was based on laboratory data. What unsettled scholars was not only the age of the manuscripts, but what that age meant. If Ethiopian texts were this early and had been used continuously, then their differences could not be dismissed as later corruption. They reflected a Christian tradition that developed early and continued on its own path. This also challenged long-held academic habits. European archives had long been treated as the center of Christian preservation, while African traditions were considered secondary. The dating results complicated that view. Wars, reforms, and repeated destruction of libraries disrupted manuscript survival in Europe. Ethiopian monasteries, by contrast, preserved texts with far fewer interruptions. Some scholars responded cautiously, arguing that age alone does not determine authority. That is true, but age does remove an excuse. It removes the claim that these texts are too late or too distant from early Christianity to matter. Once that excuse disappeared, dismissal was no longer defensible. With authenticity established, the debate could no longer focus on when these texts were written. It had to move to a far more uncomfortable question. What exactly did these early preserved texts contain that others later chose not to keep? The books that made people uncomfortable. Once the age of the Ethiopian manuscripts could no longer be dismissed, attention shifted to what those books actually said. That is where the real problem began. Some of these texts describe a spiritual world that is violent, unstable, and deeply invasive. This was not a safe universe where good always wins cleanly and evil stays clearly marked. It was a world where boundaries are crossed, rules are broken, and damage spreads in ways that cannot be easily undone. One of the most troubling examples is the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopia while disappearing from most Western traditions. The New Testament book of Jude quotes directly from Enoch, indicating that early Christians treated it as authoritative scripture. According to this text, certain angels did not remain in their assigned roles. They descended into the human world, taught forbidden knowledge, and directly interfered with human life. These beings are not metaphors or symbols. They are described as making decisions, taking sides, and causing real destruction. Their actions lead to chaos, violence, and suffering on a massive scale. The text does not soften the consequences. It describes a chain reaction. Angels break their limits. Humans learn what they were never meant to know. Power spreads faster than wisdom. Violence follows. Corruption multiplies. This creates a world where disaster is not an accident, but the result of deliberate choices made by both divine beings and humans. That idea alone shattered the comfort of simple explanations. These writings also refuse to make evil easy to locate. Sin is not treated as a small personal failure that can be erased with ritual. Corruption enters through knowledge, desire, and imitation. Humans are influenced by forces beyond them, but they are still held responsible for what they do with what they learn. According to these texts, being misled does not remove guilt. Knowing better and choosing wrongly carries consequences that cannot be undone. In this framework, innocence is fragile. Humans are not portrayed as helpless victims waiting for rescue. They are portrayed as participants who can amplify destruction or resist it. Choices matter at a structural level. One action can affect families, communities, and generations. There is no guarantee that damage will be repaired quickly or at all. This removes reassurance. It replaces it with permanent accountability. The spiritual world in these books is equally disturbing. Power does not flow through a neat chain of command. Authority fractures, order collapses, punishment is severe, but restoration is uncertain. According to some interpretations, even divine systems can fail if boundaries are ignored. That kind of world cannot be easily summarized or controlled. It demands constant attention and responsibility from the reader. This is where these texts became dangerous to institutions. A belief system like this cannot be reduced to short rules or slogans. It forces people to think constantly about influence, responsibility, and consequence. Interpretation becomes personal. Obedience becomes less automatic. Authority becomes harder to enforce. According to reports from early debates, leaders did not fear these texts because they were false. They feared them because they were destabilizing. They complicated blame. They removed excuses. They placed responsibility directly on individuals rather than systems. Managing that kind of belief required effort and maturity that not every community could sustain. Over time, discomfort became distance. Distance became silence. These books were not burned publicly or denounced loudly. They were simply no longer read. Yet even these texts were not the most sensitive. They challenged how people understood angels, corruption, and responsibility, but they stopped short of touching the moment that defines Christianity itself. The real silence begins after one specific moment in the story everyone thinks they know. The days the story rushed past. In all four canonical Gospels, the same pattern appears. The resurrection happens, the tomb is found empty, and then the story moves quickly toward the ascension. The shift is abrupt. One moment, death is defeated. The next, Jesus is gone. The space in between is brief, fragmented, and strangely quiet. The Gospels offer only scattered moments from this period. A meeting here, a short conversation there, a meal, a command to wait. There is no sustained teaching, no detailed explanation, no long instruction. The Gospel of Matthew dedicates multiple chapters to the Sermon on the Mount, but only a single short chapter to all post-resurrection appearances combined. This imbalance is striking because the resurrection is presented as the central event of Christian belief. If death has just been overcome, logic suggests that what follows should be the clearest and most important teaching of all. That silence raises an uncomfortable question. Why would the most influential teacher in Christian history, now beyond fear of death, say almost nothing afterward? Why rush past the moment when clarity should be at its highest? Why leave followers with parables and warnings delivered before the crucifixion, but almost no guidance after it? Early Christian communities noticed this gap. According to historical records and later debates, the period between resurrection and ascension became a point of disagreement. Some believed teachings were given but never recorded publicly. Others believed they were shared only with certain followers. What is clear is that this window mattered more to early Christians than it does to later traditions. Over time, attention shifted away from this period. Later, theology focused heavily on belief before death and salvation after it. The days in between were treated as a transition, not a destination. The resurrection became an ending rather than a beginning. That choice simplified the story, but it also left something unresolved. Ethiopian tradition took a different approach. According to church accounts, texts existed that focused directly on the days following the resurrection. These writings were not treated as side notes or devotional extras. They were treated as sensitive material. They were preserved carefully and separated from public teaching. The question then becomes how such material survived when other traditions let the silence remain. According to reports from Ethiopian monastic history, writings connected to this period were transmitted with restrictions. They were not copied freely or taught openly. Some were preserved through tightly controlled manuscript traditions. Others were guarded alongside texts already considered difficult or destabilizing. What makes this gap unsettling is not just what is missing, but the consistency of its absence elsewhere. A moment that should have been central was reduced to a footnote. A period that should have carried weight was passed over quickly. By the time modern scholars began paying attention again, the silence itself had become part of the story. And when attention finally returned to that silence, it led directly to the material that had been kept out of sight. The translated resurrection passage. For centuries, this resurrection text existed in silence. It was copied, guarded, and restricted, but not widely read outside Ethiopia. That changed recently. According to reports from scholars working with Ethiopian church authorities, a focused translation effort began in the early 2020s as part of a larger project to catalog and preserve fragile manuscripts. Advances in high-resolution imaging, digital restoration, and language modeling made it possible to study texts that were previously too damaged or complex to translate with confidence. This resurrection passage stands apart immediately. It describes Jesus remaining with his followers for 40 days after rising from the dead. That detail alone shifts the story. The resurrection is no longer a brief appearance followed by disappearance. It becomes an extended period of direct contact, sustained presence, and deliberate instruction. What is striking is what he does not do. According to the translated text, Jesus does not repeat parables from before his death. He does not retell moral lessons already given. There are no stories meant to soften the message. Instead, he speaks plainly. The tone is urgent and controlled. Death no longer limits him, and because of that, his language changes. There is no need to hint or circle around meaning. He addresses his followers directly. According to the passage, his warnings are specific. He speaks of future leaders who will use his name as a tool, not to heal but to build authority, not to guide but to gather wealth, not to free but to create fear. This is not presented as a distant possibility. It is described as an expected outcome. Power, he says, will wear his identity and speak his words while doing the opposite of what he taught. One of the most unsettling instructions concerns institutions. According to the text, Jesus warns his followers not to build permanent religious structures meant to replace inner responsibility. Systems decay, he explains. Titles multiply. Rules harden. People become dependent on forms instead of awareness. His focus is not on preserving an organization, but on preserving the individual. The passage then turns inward. It describes the human soul as vulnerable, not only to obvious wrongdoing, but to subtle decay. Attention matters, desire matters, speech matters. According to the text, corruption does not enter all at once. It enters through repeated focus on what feeds fear, pride, and distraction. Over time, this leads to what the passage describes as spiritual death while the body remains alive. This idea is presented without comfort. A person can function, speak, and participate in society, yet be internally collapsed. The danger is not physical death. The danger is becoming empty while still moving. According to the passage, This condition spreads quietly through imitation and habit. The protection offered is not ritual. It is not obedience to authority. It is awareness. The text emphasizes knowledge as active attention, watching thought, guarding speech, controlling desire before it hardens into habit. This is not presented as optional advice. It is presented as survival instruction. According to scholars involved in the translation, this direct and unsheltered tone is what made the passage so difficult to release. It does not support hierarchy. It does not comfort institutions. It places responsibility entirely on the individual. That alone explains why it remained hidden for so long. Once this translation circulated beyond Ethiopia, the response was immediate. Some readers felt exposed. Others felt anger. Many felt threatened. The debate that turned dark. When the translated resurrection passage began circulating outside Ethiopia, the reaction was immediate but hidden. There were no public debates, no announcements, no official statements. According to reports from academics and church insiders, the first responses happened in private rooms, small meetings, letters exchanged quietly, conversations among theologians and church authorities who understood very quickly what the text actually said. The concern was not that the passage rejected Christian belief. It did not deny Jesus. It did not question the resurrection. Instead, it redefined what resurrection meant. According to those who reviewed the translation, it described resurrection as something that begins during a person's lifetime, not something promised only after death. This shift created a serious problem for institutions built on delayed salvation. Religious systems have historically relied on mediated salvation, the idea that spiritual authority flows through official channels, meaning access to forgiveness, meaning, and final redemption is controlled by recognized structures, offices, and rules. When resurrection is framed as an internal condition rather than a future event overseen by authority, that structure weakens. From an institutional point of view, this is destabilizing. A system built on obedience and ritual depends on people needing permission. If clarity and inner stability are no longer mediated, fear becomes less effective. Authority becomes less necessary. Control becomes harder to justify. The passage also alters how resurrection itself functions as a tool of governance. According to interpretations, resurrection is not something granted later by an institution. It is something that begins internally through awareness and responsibility. Fear loses leverage. Promises of future reward lose urgency. Compliance based on threat or hope becomes unreliable. This helps explain why such teachings would alarm any empire aligned with religion. Empires require populations that respond predictably to symbols, authority, and consequence. If people believe they can reach stability without institutional mediation, systems of control weaken. A population that does not fear punishment or depend on reward becomes difficult to manage. The most unsettling element of the passage is its warning about corruption. According to the text, danger would not come from outsiders or enemies of Christianity. It would come from within, from institutions that use Jesus' name, symbols, and authority to gather power. This is not framed as a possibility, it is framed as an outcome. In this framework, hierarchy itself becomes evidence. Titles become warning signs. Sacred authority becomes a test. The more power an institution claims, the more closely it fits the pattern described. That places organized religious leadership in an impossible position. At that point, the debate shifted. Accuracy was no longer the central issue. Control was. According to some accounts, discussions focused on stability, unity, and governability. Leaders worried about fragmentation, loss of obedience, and the inability to manage belief if such teachings spread freely. Limiting the passage was framed internally as protection. Protection of order, protection of unity, protection of people believed to be unprepared. It was not described as censorship. It was described as responsibility. In the end, Rome did not fear incorrect belief. It feared something far more dangerous: people who could govern themselves.